Let's talk about Girl in the Creek by Wendy N Wagner. I picked this up as an advanced listening copy from NetGalley. I had heard about this like last summer. I think it was from Kayla at Books and Lala, but who knows at this point? Because now that it's out, it came out on Tuesday. I've heard a lot of people talking about it in the last couple months leading up to it. So who knows who I originally heard talk about it. But I also heard Wendy talk about it at Emerald City Comic Con and was like, I'm going to try and pick that up. And then it was available on NetGalley. So I thought, hey, let's see if we can get an ARC. And I got an ARC. And I tried the audio listening and really enjoyed that format. So this is kind of going to be a review, but at the same time, I've done a review on Storygraph. You can read it there. I've done a review on my Instagram. You can read that there. I think I put one up on Goodreads too, because if I get an ARC, that's really the only time I will put a review up on Goodreads, or if it's an indie author. Most of the time I tend to leave Goodreads alone. So you can read those. But what I want to talk about today is mushrooms, and mushrooms in the terms of this book. So I have been wanting to do something like this for a while. I have actually kind of been working on it, but I have just been so busy and things in my life has just been so chaotic at the moment that we're going to get a shortened version, and I have other things that relate to mushrooms that I want to talk about in other videos. So for this video, we are just going to talk about one specific topic in relating to this book. But there will be spoilers for Girl in the Creek, as well as spoilers for Sorrowland and A Desolation Called Peace, because I'm going to talk about those books in a little bit of detail that spoils a big plot twist. So if you don't want either of those books or Girl in the Creek spoiled for you, this isn't going to be the video for you, and I am perfectly okay with you leaving. If you would like to stay, however, and would like to see more videos of me talking about mushrooms, because I'm hoping to do more of these fairly soon, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and you'll see the next time that I do something like this. So let's talk about mushrooms. Okay, so if you see me looking off to the side, I have some notes up over here, and I'm going to be referring to them. So that is what's happening. We're going to try and do notes today. I never do this, so fingers crossed that this works out okay. So in preparing for this, I started looking up mushrooms as a metaphor, because I noticed that they were being used for a lot of things. I'm sure anybody who reads or pays attention to things has noticed that things in books can be metaphors for other things and can be symbols for different things, and mushrooms tend to get used a lot in specific contexts. Horror, which is what we're talking about today, tends to use mushrooms fairly frequently. I know there's a couple big TV shows around mushrooms, which I might make myself watch soon, and some books recently, and I myself have been gravitating towards fungal horror fairly recently. This is my 4th fungal horror since May, so seems to be a thing. But when I started doing the research and looking up how they are typically used, because I like to have a frame to look at things through, right? So I started looking up how they tend to be used as metaphors in literature, media, things like that. I found some weird blogs. Mostly what I was finding was blogs and articles in Christian magazines. Apparently there's a whole thing lately, and I don't quite know why. So that was fascinating. But when I finally found some good ones that related to what I was looking for, and not just using mushrooms as a fable, there's a few categories, and there are things that I noticed as well. So my major category that I was thinking about was mushrooms as communication. You have also the symbol of death and decay, right? Because that's the horror of it all. So the big category is death and decay. Mushrooms, if you see a visual of a room with mushrooms coming out of the walls, you assume something died there. Or something has spoiled and gone bad. Mushrooms are a symbol of death, but with the mushroom coming out of it, you have rebirth and life. And along with that, you have sex. If you have life, you have to have sex, some sort of reproduction to have it happen, correct? And people tend to like to use mushrooms as a phallic symbolism. So I was watching a video today from PBS Eons that was talking about cordyceps, in another video. And that's the zombie ant fungus. And they were talking about how alien can be a metaphor for fungus. And alien is also incredibly phallic shaped in a lot of ways. And there's lots of videos on the symbolism of that that was purposeful. And then you have magic and the fae. So if you think about I had it earlier and I forgot it. Is that Amanites?
Of course, I remember to stop recording that it's the Amanita mushroom.
I can't remember. The red and white mushroom, right? The magic mushroom that goes along with gnomes and fairies and hallucinations. And so you'll often have that associated with a symbol for magic, and or associated with a person who is a specific stereotype of people, right? So, but none of those are what we're going to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about the communication and connection. And this is because mushrooms tend to communicate through each other, which is something I will describe as we go on. But we have the idea of a mushroom. If you think about the hyphae, which are essentially the roots of a mushroom, you'll see them look a lot like when you see pictures of neurons. And so they often get used as symbols for communication and connection. So when I think about books that have talked about or used mushrooms or fungus in terms of communication, we have a distillation called Peace, which is the sequel to a memory called Empire, and we have Sorrowland and Girl in the Creek. And they all kind of have this connection of using fungus in a very similar way, but different for each of the books. Very briefly is how we're going to talk about Sorrowland and a distillation called Peace. So Sorrowland has a fungus that is being used to essentially poison a community. And this is a cult that has formed out in the woods, a religious cult, a specific sect of Christianity that our main character Vern was brought into when she was a very young child. And we find out through the book that these people are being dosed with this fungus as part of a government experiment. So the government is experimenting on them to see what exposing them to this fungus over generations will do to them because of nefarious government goals. Why could I not think of the word goals? I don't know. So there's lots of other things in this book. That whole government experimentation on Black people, which has happened throughout history, is the main aspect of that book. But we use this fungus because this fungus gives connection between the characters in the books. So those that are infected with the fungus, they have to be like strapped down at night to sleep because they're haunted. And they're, of course, given a religious explanation for these hauntings, but the hauntings are because the fungus is giving them the memories of everyone who has died after consuming this fungus. And most people tend to die over consuming this fungus. Vern is a special one who gets some, she not only survives, but she gets some additional things, some additional benefits, which I'll talk about in other mushroom topics, but not in this one. But because that it's interesting, but it has nothing to do with the communication aspect. The communication aspect is the gaining of the ancestral knowledge and the memories of everyone through this fungal connection. And it ends up appearing as ghosts who you don't actually have a connection with, like physically, but just this mental memory sharing connection, which is similar to a distillation called Peace, where we have this alien race who is attacking our main characters, and everyone's kind of freaked out by them because they don't understand how they communicate. They can't figure them out. And eventually it's discovered that all of these aliens have consumed this fungus that makes them all connected to each other, like a hive mind, like the Borg, if you're familiar. They speak as a we, essentially. And they do have like divisions. That does seem that there is some break in the levels of it, but it's at what level do they break and how do they break and where does you stop and we begin, and does it matter? Does it matter? That's the question. And so that's a kind of a little bit more abstract, but this fungus does try to jump to new people, to new hosts. If the host dies, it fruits and turns to spores and infects the next available living body because there's a symbiotic relationship. But how much of the original host is retained is the question that's kind of asked at the end. And does that matter? Does that matter? Would it matter to you? So those ones. And then we have Girl in the Creek, which has the connection aspect, but also the decay aspect, because we are kind of reanimating a dead body throughout this story, and perhaps multiple dead bodies. This fungus doesn't want you to necessarily be alive, potentially, if you're a human. Hard to tell. It kind of goes back and forth on what it actually wants, because it does want. And that's because this one came from space. But the interesting thing is using mushrooms in this way as a form of communication. And it's fascinating because mushrooms do communicate with each other, like I said, through hyphae, which are like the roots of the mushroom or little connections in the brain. There's a Guardian article that I found while I was writing this out that I want to mention, and it's called Mushrooms Communicate with Each Other Using Up to 50 Words, Scientist Claims. That's the title. So I'm going to read you this paragraph from it. It's very short, and I will link the article in the description because I think it's really interesting. It is a couple years old, but that just means more advancements in this have been made. So the quote, previous research has suggested that fungi conduct electrical impulses through long underground filamentous structures called hyphae, similar to how nerve cells transmit information in humans. It is even shown that the firing rate of these impulses increases when the hyphae of wood-digesting fungi come into contact with wooden blocks, raising the possibility that the fungi are using this electrical language to share information about food or injury with distant parts of themselves or with hyphae-connected partners such as trees. So I went through the links in the article to get back to the original article, the research paper that was published, and it's actually really fascinating what they did. So that article is titled Language of Fungi Derived from Their Electrical Spiking Activity. So I'll link this as well because it's open source, so anybody can read it. It's dense and has a lot in it, but if you're better than me, you'll understand more of it. I skimmed it very briefly, kind of looking for the highlights and reading the introduction. So I want to read you a little bit from the last bit of the introduction because I thought it was really interesting. So it says, there is an emerging body of studies on language of creatures without nervous systems and invertebrates. Biocommunication in ciliates include extracellular signaling, chemotaxis as expression of communication, signals for vesicle trafficking, hormonal communication, and pheromones. So I think all of these are really interesting and kind of talk about, the paper kind of talks about more of this, but it goes on to say that electrical signaling is something that is been investigated. So all of these would be very interesting horror avenues. It would be fascinating. So this is a ciliate, so it can communicate, and of course, if you're like, oh yeah, everything should be able to communicate somehow, right? We have body language, we have things like that, but little organisms communicate to each other as well. The idea of mushrooms having their own language is pretty fascinating. I mean, we know that plants can signal to each other and communicate with each other through different chemical compounds that they produce in all sorts of various ways. And one of them, the ways that they communicate, is through mycorrhizal fungi networks. And plants actually do a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi, which can increase soil productivity, increases the health of the plant, allows them to metabolize all the nutrients available to them because the fungi make the soil better and increase the nutrient density, and then the plants process it and share that with the fungi. And so we get this really cool symbiotic relationship, and it also allows the plant to communicate with other plants about threats in the area or other various environmental factors. Absolutely fascinating, but we're not talking about trees and plants. So we also know that dolphins have unique sounds that they make, and bumblebees dance to each other to explain where things are. So, of course, why wouldn't everything have some unique way of communicating? But it's weird, right? Because you think about something that doesn't have an eye, doesn't have a mouth, it doesn't have like hands or arms or limbs or like, oh, how would that thing communicate? Especially when you're thinking of something like a hyphae that grows. Would that doesn't move? And we typically associate communication with a form of movement. It has to be some sort of movement, right? You move your mouth, you move your vocal cords, you move your hands. I move my hands a lot. You move parts of your body, minute facial expressions. All sorts of things are parts of communication, but could you imagine if we just communicated through a little electrical zaps through the air? That type of communication is very difficult for a human to grasp. So it makes it really good for horror because lack of understanding tends to scare people. An innate fear of something new, neophobia, is what keeps things alive. Like if you just go up and investigate every new thing and you're a little mouse in the wild, one of those things might be something that could eat you. So it's really good to kind of have a fear of new things. But as humans, we are really good at gathering data, and so we should be able to take in extra information and be able to process these things, but that's not instantaneous. So there's always this weird fear of something that is weird because it's new and we don't quite understand it. And so if someone just started zapping you to speak to you, you would be very uncomfortable in a few different ways. So the idea of communication through electrical pulses is weird enough for horror. Like, it's not terrifying, but it adds an element of something, of the unknown, and the unknown is a good basis for fear and a good basis for horror. I want to go back to the paper real quick because this is really interesting. It's not important in the grand scheme of things, but I think it's fascinating. They looked at a few different species, so I'll show you one of the plots here. These are the signals that they mapped, and I don't want to get in the weeds with it because I don't know enough about it, but I do know that each of these plots is a different species. And so one of the species that they looked at, Enoki, that's the B plot, that one has the most diverse amount of signals. And cordyceps, which is at the top, that one, I'll put the full scientific name here because I don't remember it. That one has the least amount of spiking. So you can see the little peaks are like a lot less. And so there are potentially not just mushroom communication, but differentiation and communication throughout the species. And who knows why? I'm sure more work has been done on this. So, I mean, if you do look up the paper, you can see what cited it, so you can see what's new, because this came out, I think, in 2019, or I don't know. The Guardian article was 3 years old, so it probably came out in 2021 or 2022. So it's fairly new work. So more stuff should be done, but maybe not a lot. So if you're interested in that, you can click through the links and see if you can find out more information. What does this have to do with Girl in the Creek? Well, basically, let's get into the book. We have a fungus from outer space. We have a cosmic origin, and that adds a different element of something to the horror of it. It gives it this eldritchy feel to the book. I'm not going to critique it necessarily, but I could. No. So we have from outer space, and so that gives it this extra level, and it gives it more of a sentience. So we have chapters from the perspective of this sentient organism, and it's able to take all different forms of fungus. We have some that look like slime molds. We have turkey tails and like morels and different shapes and all sorts of different things. And we also have these threads. When the fungus is protecting its host, it appears as threads like worms that the hyphae are essentially extending and growing very quickly and able to be used as grasping things, as well as it is bursting into spores very, very quickly. The reproductive rate on this mushroom is like intensely high, or this fungus is intensely high, and it's able to colonize a new environment very, very quickly. And the rules on that were a little difficult for me to suss out on one read. It refers to itself consistently as the strangeness, which is kind of interesting in that it refers to itself as the strangeness. Or is that the remnants of the host referring to it as the strangeness, and then it identified with that and kept using it? It's very difficult to tell. That does add for an extra element of what is actually happening here, and that kind of level of confusion tends to be common in fungal horror books, at least that I've read recently. There tends to be a little bit of like a dreamlike kind of, we don't really fully understand what's happening type of element to it, which adds to the uncertainty and the horror of the story. It uses all sorts of different chemical communication and sensing to understand its environment. So that is kind of being combined with the human element of understanding. So when a character is seeing something happen, they're not just seeing it and hearing it and tasting it. Like, they're tasting the thoughts, they're tasting the words, they're tasting the shape of something, they're smelling someone's emotions, they're like getting all this extra elemental information of what is happening around them, and then they are communicating that to other parts of the fungal body that it's able to communicate with across space. And one thing that I kept coming back to, and anytime I have reading these ones, is a fungal network can communicate with itself because it is spread across. So one of the largest organisms is this big fungus I think it's in Oregon. I will put it up because I can't remember. It's been a very long time since I talked about it, but it's this big fungal mass, and it can communicate across miles because it is connected. So my question is, every time we have these horror funguses where they're able to communicate to other hosts, are they like connecting through the ground to that other person? Is everyone connected through strings, or are we connected through spores in the air that we can't see that are microscopic? Like, that's the part I'm always like, how are we doing the communicating across distances when we are not physically connected? Because that's how mushrooms are able to do it. They are physically connected, or apparently they're doing electro signaling through the soil. Not sure how far away they had to be, or how far away they could be, or how close they had to be for that to work. Sure, it's in the paper. But like I said, I skimmed the parts that I wanted to talk about. So it's kind of interesting in these liberties that we take when we talk about fungal horror. But it does use electrical pulses. There's always this like reference of a sparking or a tingling when the fungus is trying to communicate with the host body. And so we have characters who have different levels of this fungus overtaking their body, and our main character decides that she can live with some level of the fungal infection because she's able to connect to more of the world around her. She's able to sense things. She still is connected with some of the wildlife that also had this infection. And so it kind of ends us with this question of, for a greater sense of connection and community, would you allow your body to be a host for something that was sentient and had its own interpretation of how things should go and its own desires and its own goals, with the constant risk of that thing could eventually overtake you? And when would you stop being you? And when would you start being a we? When would those desires overtake yours, and how would you know? And would you be willing to make that choice in order to have that greater sense of connection and community? And that's kind of what it leaves you with, which leaves you on a little bit deeper of a question than you maybe expected from a fungal rot horror. So community and connection is essentially what this book talks about a lot in different ways, as well as just the horrors of being alive. So that's kind of my thoughts on the fungal element of Girl in the Creek. Let me know if you've read it and what your thoughts are, and if you like this kind of dissection of a specific part of a book, and enjoyed it, because I kind of enjoyed talking about it once I figured out how I wanted to talk about it. So I want to do more of these. I have some more mushroom books lined up, and then maybe some other things. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and we'll talk more about something else soon.